Welcome to Whole Health. We're happy you're here on this journey of exploration with us as we learn what it means to live a life dedicated to spiritual, mental, and physical health. Before we begin our program, we want to share a brief legal disclaimer. The information provided on this program, including any health-related advice or discussions, is for general informational purposes only and should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always consult a qualified healthcare professional before making any decisions regarding your health. Now, let's turn it over to Pastor Jeremy, Dr. Kala Kleen, and Brittany Pfeifner for today's episode of Whole Health.
Welcome back to Whole Health, where faith meets function, and we learn how to steward our bodies as the sacred temples that God created them to be. I'm Jeremy Higgins, and I'm joined today by Dr. Kala Kleen, a chiropractor and functional medicine provider. In previous episodes, we've explored nutrition, fasting, movement. We've talked about the gut-brain connection. These are all threads in the tapestry of God's beautiful design. Today, we're stepping into a topic that I think brings some hesitation, even some deep questions to a lot of families, to a lot of parents. We're going to be talking about vaccines. Now, we're not here to divide, and our intent is not to scare. We're here to seek truth with open hearts, honoring God's word, right? Proverbs chapter 2, verse 6. It says, "For the Lord gives wisdom, from his mouth comes knowledge and understanding." And that's what we want. We want the knowledge and understanding of the Lord, and we want to be able to apply it to our lives. Now, in this episode, we're going to explore the history of vaccines in America. We're going to talk about major court rulings that shaped mandates, the explosion of the modern schedule, manufacturer liability, vaccine injuries, waning immunities, ethical concerns such as fetal cell lines. And we'll also shine light on natural alternatives that God's aligned for us. He has a plan, and I think that plan is pretty evident in nature. So let's dive in. But before we unpack the data, I think it's important to start with God's word. Our bodies, they're not accidents. They're actually fearfully and wonderfully made. God designed immunity with breast milk and colostrum. Our gut microbiome. There's all kinds of aspects and facets to God's design of the perfect immune system. Vaccines entered the story centuries ago. Scripture calls for discernment, right? 1 Thessalonians 5:21. If you go to Calvary, you hear me use that scripture all the time. Prove all things and hold fast that which is good. Healthcare is not one size fits all. Personalized decisions matter, especially when informed consent is seldom emphasized. And that's why I want Dr. Kala to set the stage. From your 16 years as both a provider and a mom, what have you seen?
Yeah, this topic is just such a polarizing topic. And typically as a chiropractor, a lot of times people, when they find I'm a chiropractor in different social settings, be like, oh my gosh, are you anti-vaccine?
Right.
That's one of the most common things, that comes up. And I know years ago, both after my son and daughter, we have these minor outbreaks here and there. And even the local news, they called for a segment to say, okay, what's your stance on it? And I've never been one that's necessarily anti-vax by any means. It's just that I'm pro-informed consent.
Amen.
And over the years, I have seen the extremes, even within the chiropractic, the naturopathic community, that it's, the shame of how dare you even consider that you would do this to your child. But then I've seen the exact opposite end of the spectrum of how dare you, why wouldn't you do it?
Right.
And so then, when you look at young parents, and even when Tyler and I were first starting out, it's just a shame-filled, irritated, highly intense situation that sometimes if you take one of the extremes, you leave families disenchanted and feeling like they don't have any other choice but to either potentially harm them on either side of the spectrum.
Right.
Because you have highly educated professionals that are very, very, no, you shouldn't vaccinate. And you've got other professionals with fancy degrees that say, how dare you, this is for their protection and for the community betterment.
Right. And try to shame you when you're maybe not wanting to do that. And that can be a difficult thing as a parent.
Yeah. And I actually called my husband on the way here, just knowing that this, topic was going to come up. And I said, Tyler, thinking back when it came to this topic, because I knew from the get-go, I didn't want to vaccinate our children based on a lot of different reasons, which we can get into. But I asked Tyler, so he's a chemical engineer, and his family, very conventional medicine. I would joke that sometimes if they're around somebody who maybe have been sick, Tyler's rationale was like, well, should I take the Tylenol before the fever even starts, to be prophylactic. And so I asked him, I said, ultimately, what do you recall when our daughter was born? What made you feel surrendered and confident that we were making the right decision to not vaccinate. And he said, he goes, well, my first rationale is I was vaccinated, I'm fine, so why wouldn't we do that to our kids?
Sure.
And he's like, then you like brought up the vaccine schedule from the 1980s compared to, our daughter was born in 2012. And he's like, that was shock number one, which made me, I need to question this. This sounds a little, insane. Shock number two that he said, raised a lot of eyebrows was, 2 weeks old vaccinating for hepatitis B.
Right.
And he's like, that makes absolutely no sense. And then ultimately, number three, and he's like, we don't hear in the United States children dying of these diseases. He's like,
fair point.
Yeah. And he's like, but then, I had the altruistic, but what about the community good? And what if is my kid going to be the heathen that's, spreading things like wildfire, And he's like, we ultimately, that we knew that like, okay, if our kid is displaying signs of illness, we're not going to send him to school.
Right.
And so from kind of a little bit more of a common sense, what are we going to do? And, we had always said, if we lived in a country where everybody's dying of malaria, that's a different conversation about an anti-malarial
100%.
or if you get it, what is the side effects and can we get ahead of it, And so it was good to be reminded about what he felt confident in, in his decision making. And, too, if you don't mind me asking you, tell me about you and Brooke's story on vaccines and your guys' kind of evolution with the vaccine topic.
I grew up initially born in Oregon, 1971. There were very few vaccines being given at that point. My parents, I guess I had a few, but only a couple out of, I think there were 8. I think I had 3 of those 8 at that point. Years later, as a young man, even as a adolescent and teenager in my parents' home, they actually had a naturopath, functional medicine doctor, wild overachiever, Dr. David Korn, who was an MD, a chiropractor, and a dentist. This guy, he was incredible. And he really left the modern medical system to approach things a different way. And this was back in the 1980s, so a very different and early approach back then. And so we kind of grew up in a very different environment where, we didn't see the typical doctor and have the typical medical experience. And so when Brooke and I got married and, we started to have our kids, we had some real, heavy questions to answer. Actually, one of the young ladies that was in our youth ministry, her name was Grace, right before our first son was born, asked us, so are you going to vaccinate? And she had become a nurse and she had actually served, she was a traveling nurse for a number of years and served in China and she served in the UK and she served in India. Really at this point, she's been almost everywhere. She's now settled in the UK and is living there. But, we were like, gosh, we don't know. We hadn't really talked about it. It wasn't something that had come up. And she said, well, what do you think about like the fetal cell lines in the vaccines? And I was shocked. I had never heard about that before. My wife had never heard about that before. And it sent us on a journey. Brooke's a student. She loves to learn. And she just dug in. And ultimately, the information that we were able to, learn from came from government resources, from the CDC website, from the FDA website. And, we ended up making the decision not to vaccinate because there were just too many questions. And even when you look at the, history of illness alongside some of the vaccines, a lot of the illnesses started to wane off before the vaccines even came onto the scene. And so we were thinking, well, was it really the vaccine that did that anyway? And why are there so many now? And there were so few years ago. And so we made the decision to not vaccinate. And, to be, full transparency, it was hard because we had family and friends that thought that was a weird decision to make. And we had even doctors. We couldn't have a pediatrician in Arizona. When we moved here to Iowa, it was very difficult. We never were able to establish a relationship with a pediatrician. We challenged several on almost the ethics of vaccines and inevitably settled with a physician's assistant who was willing to just agree to disagree on the issue. Yeah. But for us, it was the right decision. But, informed consent, like you've already kind of touched on, that doesn't mean because we feel that way, everybody else needs to feel that way. It just means that it is important that you do your own research and you're not just listening to, the status quo, whatever the medical community has to say.
Sure. Yeah, the whole informed consent thing, we're supposed to have informed consents over every medication we ever consider or take, or even some of the naturopathic, options. It's just, risk versus benefits, and do you know, and are you completely, aware? But the informed decision making, informed consent across the board has really been watered down, or just said they're safe, just trust us, and you are crazy for asking questions and going to Google, or, labeled a conspiracy theorist just for asking questions. And so,
and to be fair, Google doesn't always have the right answer.
But absolutely.
Doing research can be a lot more than just, hey, what does the internet have to say on that top line of a search engine? Digging into the information. And I think a lot of people maybe don't want to do that, don't have time to do that. And that's part of the problem as well.
Well, and too, when I was in chiropractic school, we felt that we were just given kind of like a blanket statement. Vaccines can cause harm, maybe way more harm than we're aware. Just trust us, consider, may or may not vaccinating.
Right.
But it was very like one-sided of they're not safe and they haven't been proven safe sort of, situation. But then I feel like I've observed, especially with the American Academy of Pediatric board certified pediatricians, it's very opposite of a blanket statement. They're just safe. Just trust us. I know.
Well, the very first pediatrician that we met in Cedar Rapids, we brought our kids to, we only had 2 at that time. And she asked about, our vaccine schedule. Boy, we're so far behind. And well, we're not doing that. We're not interested in the vaccines. And, she was curious as to, what our objections were. And, we laid it out, and Brooke did an excellent job. And, she always, in these kinds of situations, she came prepared. She had paperwork, but, we just challenged the doctor, why don't you go look into this yourself? It's all stuff that we've got from the CDC website, from the FDA website. These are the ingredients in the vaccines. These are the objections that we have. And she was like, this is not true. None of this is true. She didn't use the word liar, but that was the insinuation.
Yeah.
We left. We made an appointment to go back in 2 weeks. She said she would look into it. We came back, and sure enough, she was kind of shocked. The things that we had said were true, but if we wanted her to be our doctor, we would still have to vaccinate.
Yeah.
And I thought, how in the world can we be expected to do that when our objections, first of all, we were told they weren't real.
Yes.
And then when they were found to be real, they were not important. It's important that we follow the schedule, not our own hearts. And to be fair, when you're looking into the issues, it's not just fetal cell lines in this that you should worry about. There are so many other ingredients that they shouldn't be on the shelf, let alone be forced into our children at such an early age or at all. And so we just went ahead and went a different way.
Yeah, sure. I did pull, or I wanted to discuss, so one of the information centers that I think has done some great advocacy, and again, they've long taken a stance. They're not anti-vaccine. They're very pro-informed consent, but they're often labeled as the conspiracy fuelers, and all of this stuff. But I appreciate their statement that the National Vaccine Information Center has not advocated for the abolishment of vaccination laws, as other groups have proposed. However, we've always endorsed the right to informed consent as an overreaching ethical principle in the practice of medicine, for which vaccination should be no exception. We maintain this as a responsible and ethically justifiable position to take in light of the fact that vaccination is a medical intervention performed on a healthy person that has the inherent ability to result in an injury or death of that healthy person.
Wow.
So a lot of times we'll see the American Academy of Pediatrics just attack that statement.
Sure.
And they will talk that like the prevention of death is paramount of the global community when it comes to vaccinations. And they will argue that community betterment is far superior over individual autonomy, with it. But again, furthering on their statement, as it pertains to informed consent, in consideration of, and here are some of their statements, the fact that that there can be no guarantee that the deliberate induction of a killed or live microorganism in the body of a healthy person will not compromise the health or cause death of that person either immediately or in the future. And with very few predictors having been identified by medical science to give advance warning that an injury or death may occur, and that there's no guarantee that the vaccine will indeed protect a person from contracting the disease, and I will add, and even spreading it, in the absence of adequate scientific knowledge by way of vaccines singly or in combination act in the human body at a cellular and molecular level, and the fact that vaccination is a medical procedure that can reasonably be termed as experimental each time it is performed on a healthy individual. And so, when we look at that from an informed decision making, and nurses, when they get hired on, they have to go get some of their antibodies tested for measles or mumps or rubella.
Sure.
And so they'll go, and sometimes they'll ask me to, run their order so they can go get their lab draw. And I would say we've observed 15 to 20% of the time the patient doesn't have the antibodies, even though that they've been vaccinated.
Wow.
And the standard of care, so then they'll go get their vaccine so that they can get hired on. And I ask them, I go, did you go get your antibodies retested? And they're like, no, I don't need to. And
Right.
and that's not the, these nurses' faults or these providers' faults,
Sure.
but I just think that that's interesting. I'm like, well, if it didn't happen the first time,
Right.
how can we be so
Oh my
sure that
gosh.
now you're immune, on the second time?
And that's true. Even like in my wife runs the childcare center at our
Sure.
church, and they want testing for tuberculosis for
Sure.
teachers before
Yeah.
they go into classrooms. And same kind of situation.
Yeah.
They're only interested in, did you get the vaccination? Not, do you have the antibodies?
Sure.
Not. And so, you run into the dilemma. What's really of interest to them, that you're following the rule of the law, or you're actually looking into what's, good for you, important for the community. I mean, and again,
Sure.
I think people individually have to do their homework and make informed decisions. It's a tough line for a lot of folks to cross.
Sure.
A lot of people that I talk to are either on one side of this conversation or they're on the other.
Yeah.
And I think over the years we've done our best to not, judge people if they
Yeah.
want to vaccinate their children. Those are their children. Psalm 127:3 says, "Children are the heritage of the Lord, and the fruit of the womb, it's His reward." These are actually God's kids. They're on loan to us, and I believe one day we're going to stand before the Lord and give an account.
Yeah.
And I think if they've done their research and that's the way that they want to go, we won't love them more or hate them more. It's just the decision that they've made. But we also try to err on the side of information. How can we come alongside without making it seem like we're talking down to somebody, to just share some data and,
Yeah.
even experiences that we've had. And I think, at the end of the day, the Lord's capable of working it
Sure.
out, but getting the information out there and an avenue like this, an opportunity like this to do it maybe on a little bit larger scale, man, I'm really excited about it. It's not an easy conversation to have.
Yeah.
We've already talked about, we're not trying to scare people. We're not even trying to convince you of think the way we think. Do your research. That's my hope.
Yeah, as a healthcare provider, when patients come in, that's a sacred relationship. And I've always tried to make it a point when I have certain biases to acknowledge the bias. And I think sometimes that's step one. Are you under the care of a provider that can say what their bias is, but then still respect individual decision making? And, what is the line for that? I know, since I do not work for the standard of care, I do not work for major insurance companies or an organization, because I wanted to work directly for my patient.
Right.
And so I'm very fortunate that I don't have to account to Medicare, Medicaid, Blue Cross Blue Shield, United, name whatever insurance companies. So that gives me a lot more freedom when we are deciding between providers, for the general population. If it's an in-network provider, a lot of times the standard of care and their authority over your care is dictated by an established set of care,
Right.
by your insurance company, and not even by sometimes the provider's own conscience.
Right.
And
I've experienced that with injuries that I've had. Well,
Sure.
this is what we need to do, but your insurance won't cover it unless we do this first and that first and that first.
Sure.
Well, will this and that help? Well, probably not, but we have to do those things before we can get to the other.
Yeah.
And, you kind of go, well, what if I just pay for it out of pocket? Can we
Yes.
just get there? And usually there's a much cheaper cost
Yeah.
if you pay for it out of pocket, and you can get right to what you need to do to start to correct the injury. And so I just want to say, I love that you've stepped out of the insurance industry and that you work for your patients. I have complete trust. Actually, my wife, all of my sons see Dr. CJ as their doctor, because I know that she has their best interest at heart. And it's not, well, what does the chart say that I have to do next
Yeah.
before I can get to what I think needs to be done?
Yeah.
And that's that's what's wrong with our medical community. And I appreciate that there are doctors out there like you that are doing it right.
Yeah, thank you. And again, it's such a sacred relationship and mutual conversation and dialogue when it comes to any decision making. But in my professional opinion, I do believe vaccines injuries occur. I also believe a large majority of them actually can be prevented. Oh. So for, again, those families that are going to elect, we always want to have those, sincere, heartfelt conversations, especially the first 2 years of life. It's like, okay, if they can find a provider that's willing to work with them on this. So when we were considering for our children, my daughter and my son, what is this going to look like and how are we going to have a healthcare provider? We actually did start with a pediatrician. And then before my daughter, she was about 11 months old, that we were in for one of her well child checks. And they were telling us, before her 12th month appointment or before she was 1 year old, they said she needs to be completely up to date on all of her vaccines if you want to continue to be, a patient here.
And that's a significant amount to just push all at once.
Yeah. I felt completely blindsided, by this conversation. Thought we were just there for a well child to check. Right. Didn't know we were going to have this, next 4 to 6 weeks pressure of you need to overload your kid's immune system. Right. It was a pressure, and it was like, if you're not going to do it, then sign here. Where do you want your records transferred, to? Right. And it was, to think back, I'm like, what a horrible thing to do to, right. A young family, whatever. So we were able, though, to find a provider who, again, was not a board certified pediatrician, but a family practice. And again, what I appreciated about her is that she acknowledged her bias. I think vaccines are a smart, wise, preventative measure, but she completely honored us, with that. And it was interesting. As I got to know her over the years, she's like, hey, I hate to have to ask you this because I have a feeling I know your response, but I literally have to ask you, do you want your flu shot? Do you want this? Because they have to check a box. Yep. And they can be truly in trouble and in violation if they don't even ask. So some of our families that either choose delayed or a modified schedule, I always want to be sure to say, please extend grace to the providers who are working for you and working with you on this. They have to ask it. Please don't be annoyed with them. And then a couple years later, when my son was born, ironically, our son, he gave us a run for our money.
Yeah. It's interesting how they're all so different, isn't it?
Yeah. And so we were in and out of the hospital. He was a weird story. He was having kidney stones, which babies, it's very, very rare. Yeah. The University of Iowa were phenomenal for us and with us. But yeah, they walked in the room like, we've never seen a baby with kidney stones of this nature.
That's always fun to hear as a parent.
Yeah. It was a very terrifying thing to hear, but with that, when it came to, so we would get discharged from the hospital and we would have to follow up with our primary care. So every time I'd be following up with the primary care, I'd ask her, I'm like, hey, I'm already supposed to be here coming next Friday. Can I just do the well child today? So it's one appointment. And she says, based on insurance, which we had, we were using at the time, she's like, based on your insurance company, I need to see him 6 times before he's 18 months old. And then I get a bigger kickback. And I was so grateful for her truth and honesty because I knew she wasn't getting any money from the vaccines. Or the administration of the vaccines, and she was working with us. I wanted to be sure she had the highest premium. Yeah. Because she was doing direct admits for us anytime he would get sick. So I wanted her to get the most reimbursement because I was so grateful for her services. Right. So a lot of times, especially in families that choose not to vaccinate, they are like, well, why should I go for my well child appointments? I do find the well child appointments to be extremely helpful for the sake of the growth. The growth charting and the development. And that happened then with our kiddo. We found that he was having a growth stunt that we weren't catching up because we're like, well, he's healthy. We see him acting normal, but we didn't realize that there was a growth delay from a plateau. And so that stuff was all charted, which was helpful that then we can go back on to see, okay, should we be considering an endocrinologist, X, Y, and Z. So I think it's helpful to have, a primary care, still take your kiddos to the well child, appointments 100%. If you can find a provider who, again, if you're going to do a modified vaccine schedule or, none whatsoever, especially the first 2 years. Sure. I also encourage patients, especially with little kids, if they're going to do it, to see if they can wait until their kid is 2 years old on any of them. And the reason for that is the maturity of their immune system.
Oh, that makes sense.
When we're 1 week, 2 weeks old, we haven't had a whole lot of contact with the world around us of the good bugs,
Right.
Having a dog lick your face, believe it or not, is some of the healthiest things that we can do for our kids' immune system, playing in the dirt, stuff like that.
We need more of that. Less video games, more dirt.
Yes, yeah. And so, after the age of 2, but a lot of times these young parents, they look at like the innocence and the perfect gift of their child. It is, the emotional strings of, but why wouldn't I do everything I can to protect them?
And I think that that's the card that gets played a lot with pediatricians that really want you to follow the schedule. When we were leaving the pediatrician's office that I was talking about earlier, she basically started to shame us and to tell us we're putting our children's lives at risk, and almost like a how dare you kind of moment for us. And we had to, really think on that. And, ultimately I sent her an email and I doubt it ever got to her, but, you want to send it. And it was sent in love, just letting her know the position of our hearts. It was for the betterment of our kids. We were watching out for them, not, and willing to stand in that gap and willing to take, whatever it was that she wanted to dish out to make her point, because we had done research. I mean, we had spent literally hundreds of hours, and so we were sure about the decisions that we were making. But there's that sense of, well, you're doing this and it's for their, to their detriment. And no, our heart is for good.
Yeah.
And it makes a ton of sense to me that if you were going to do it, waiting until they were mature enough, and then even the delayed schedule where there's longer gaps and there's not multiple things happening in a single visit, because that's where, you start to get into the conversation of vaccine injuries. And, I know that there's all kinds of controversy about vaccine injuries with children. We have a number of kids in our church who have vaccine injuries. Actually, Therese, who is our academy principal here, she has a son that was prior to some vaccines was perfectly fine. Afterwards, a different child, an amazing young man today.
Yeah, sure.
Don't get me wrong, he's incredible. But he changed.
Yeah.
And I listen, as a pastor of 32 years now, I have heard that story over and over and over from families. And you even see the children weeks before, and then weeks after, and you can tell there's a difference.
Yeah.
And so to say that there aren't vaccine injuries, it's short-sighted, and there's a little bit of ignorance in that.
Yeah, I think there's ignorance, and then I think there's provider bias of, if the outright denial, kind of like your scenario, that there was an outright denial by a provider who had been given how many doses daily, for how many years that individual had been in practice. But I believe there's, also there's a spectrum of the degree of vaccine injury, right? The worst being death, in some of those very severe cases. And I think so many of the providers who believe vaccines are completely safe, they're saying that death is so extremely rare.
Sure.
And paralyzation is so extremely rare. And I think to a certain degree, they're not wrong. Those are rarer. But what do we talk about? Like, why do we see autoimmunity just absolutely skyrocketing, in kids and at younger rates? And there's just, even from food sensitivities to food allergies.
I was going to bring that up. I know I've heard you talk about that in the past, some of the food sensitivities potentially connected to some of these vaccines.
Yeah.
That's really fascinating to me.
Yeah. So, skipping ahead here in some of our notes. So the history of vaccines. So before, like kind of in the 80s, they had used peanut as an adjuvant to grow,
like a peanut oil, or
a portion of a peanut. And it really, that there's been so much proof and correlation that that's what started the whole peanut allergy issue, is because we're injecting a child and we want the immune system to have a reaction so that then it can identify and offer the protection. And again, when vaccines came to the market, they really, I think if you even go to like vaccinehistory.org, I think they talk about it was like the 14th century that they were pulling scabs of an illness and then giving it in microdosing, right? So it's kind of like the modern day chicken pox party. Like, kids got chicken pox.
That's what we did when I was a kid.
Yeah. And so, the idea of vaccination, like there is evidence that supports this is good and wise. But again, we're living in 2025. modern America.
Right.
And when we look at the vaccines, measles, mumps, rubella, how many people do any of us know that have had any of them? Now, granted, in Iowa, yes, there was an outbreak and a lot of people panicked. If they were panicking, they could go get their antibodies tested to see, are they protected?
Sure.
Oftentimes, it happened again in Iowa that somebody contracted mumps from somebody who was vaccinated.
Oh, interesting.
And again, kind of going back to just because you're vaccinated doesn't mean that you're protected and doesn't mean that
Right.
you can't get it, sort of thing. But they've since pulled peanuts and a lot now there's like an egg, which now we see egg as one of the most common food intolerant and one of the highest food known allergens
Wow.
as a result. And sometimes the argument, that I've heard is like, well, it's a necessary evil for the protection in order to get, these vaccines to work. But again, as patients, navigate, should I vaccinate, should I not? And I think take it, on a vaccine by vaccine, diagnose
Sure.
or, criteria. When Tyler's like, well, I'm totally fine with our kids getting chickenpox. That is an easy no-brainer. Definitely don't need to do that one.
Right.
Whooping cough was a little bit scarier at the time because there had been some cases of it. But again, the likelihood of it leading to death is very rare, especially in already healthy kids.
Sure.
Which we were fortunate and lucky that we were dealing with at the time. But kind of the histories, the one in the United States, or where a lot of people, say that was the first vaccine was from Edward Jenner in the 1700s, where people were protected from smallpox through the variolation, which is like the very thing itself, just microdosing. And then several accounts from the 1500s describe smallpox inoculation as practiced in China and India. But then Jenner came up with a cowpox-based inoculation in 1796. Then it expanded in the 1900s with diphtheria and the pertussis or whooping cough vaccines. And then that's when we really started to see this shift to mass immunization efforts. The Jonas Salk introduced the polio in the 1950s. Right. And then Sabin, the oral polio vaccine in 1961. So this is where a lot of those of us who elect to not vaccinate or do alternative schedules, when we look at the polio cases before the vaccines even came out, polio was declining.
Right.
And then because it was a live vaccine, they found that the very vaccine, then that's what was spiking so many of the positive cases was from the vaccine, itself. And millions of people were exposed. And unfortunately, some people, that maybe would have been able to survive getting polio because they got the vaccine. Actually, there's some correlation and potential that they actually died as a result.
Oh, wow.
Versus if they just would have had natural exposure and gotten it, that their immune system would have been better off.
Well, back to God's perfect design, he did create this incredible immune system. And the more we can expose, the more we get exposed to, the greater and stronger it becomes. And so, it's tragic that this is the kind of the history that leads us to where we're at, but it makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah,
absolutely. And then kind of from like the legal landmark standpoint, 1905 was Jacobson versus Massachusetts, and the Supreme Court upheld the state vaccine mandates. And so that's why we see that there's a state by state difference. Iowa, we're fortunate that we have the religious exemption, and you can get a medical exemption. I found it's very hard to get a medical exemption in the state of Iowa to get a provider to. When we were at that appointment, when I felt like I was getting berated about vaccinating our daughter rapidly, I had shared the story. So I had a brother who at 2.5 months old passed away, and the death certificate says SIDS, but it was within 2 to 3 days from his SIDS from his whooping cough vaccination. And my mom, as I asked her about it, she said it was within hours that they got home that he was coughing and hacking and congested. And I looked at his autopsy. She shared it with me a couple years ago, and reading the autopsy. it's very interesting to take a really healthy kid and that a pediatrician. So when I brought that up with her, she's like, there's no correlation that was from the vaccine. And I said, well, I have 5 nephews, all of them born in the military system, and all 5 were vaccinated, but one from each brother had a negative reaction to the whooping cough where, the fingertips are turning purple and needed oxygen and monitoring with medical attention, for 24 hours. And I said, I think that there's, we potentially are candidates for a medical exemption. And she's like, there's no way that that's a medical exemption. And I'm like, I had the dialogue with her.
Shocking.
I'm like, so if we, if my child receives this shot today and then she doesn't wake up tomorrow, how do you feel about that? And she's like, it would not be because of the vaccine.
That's wild to me. I mean, actually, the unfortunate part of the conversation is, again, so many years of ministry, and the most difficult funerals I've had to do are children, especially, and a SIDS death is just so tragic. They're often connected within a few days of a vaccine. It's not a rare thing to hear. As a matter of fact, it's rare to hear that a child did pass from what is labeled as SIDS that didn't recently have a vaccine. And so for the medical community to still look at that and to not use that data appropriately, it's questionable.
Yeah, the SIDS and timing correlation, the SIDS age peak is 2 to 4 months, but that's the same window of the heaviest schedule and the biggest introduction. And so, the American Academy of Pediatrics will say correlation does not prove causation. But, why aren't we, raising some eyebrows to that?
Right.
At the same time.
It's worth a conversation and further investigation. But if it doesn't fit the narrative, then, it's not going to meet the criteria to get raised up the flagpole, if you will.
Sure. So, Jeremy, I know, too, when you and Brooke were going through this, you were talking a lot about the ingredients and the additives was like a big reason.
Yeah.
Can you tell me more about that?
Well, gosh, I should invite Brooke in, and then we could all get schooled a little bit. But, for us, there were so many variables within pretty much every vaccine. It's not to say that they all had things that were questionable, but because we found so many that did have like the mercury and things, and I get it, now they're guaranteeing us that the mercury's been removed from the vaccines. Why was it in there in the first place? It's proven to be a poison. Why would we use it in that kind of environment? It's going to be used on the most innocent and fragile amongst us. And so we started to just really look at a variety of factors that at the end of the day, the data just stacked up. When you start to pile, if you have a scale.
Sure.
And on one side, you're putting data that's, pro-vaccine.
Sure.
And then the other side, you're putting the data that's, con. There were very few of the pros, and I get it. There's the conversation, well, these things can help to eradicate illnesses or keep your child from contracting something that, they probably will if you don't do this. But again, those conversations are difficult for me because so many of these diseases are all but eradicated.
Yep.
And so we're having conversations about vaccines that we want to put in our kids. Some of them, HPV and things, you think, well, that just seems kind of absurd at such a young age in the first place. So there was just so much data on the con side and very little on the pro that we were just unable to say we could move forward with the right heart.
Sure.
And so we prayed, we brought it before the Lord.
Sure.
Lord, we're trying to honor you. Our goal is to, train these children up to raise them in the healthiest way that we can and to one day stand before you and be able to say we did our best. And with all of the data that Brooke collected and that we waded through, it just didn't make any sense for us to proceed down that road.
Yeah. No, and I appreciate that, and it was one person that had the conversation and said, did you know?
Right.
To even get that question of what, why wouldn't you, sort of thing. So when it comes to some of the adjuvants, so aluminum is a big one.
Oh, yeah.
There's 25 micrograms, requires a hazardous warning label. However, the FDA says a safe threshold is 5 micrograms per kilogram. So in the Hib vaccine, there's 225 micrograms. The hepatitis B has 250 micrograms. The DTaP has anywhere, because it varies based on manufacturer, anywhere from 170 to 625 micrograms. And the hepatitis A has 25 micrograms, and the HPV vaccine has 225 micrograms. And, it's interesting just how quickly they can say, oh, it's safe, it's safe, it's safe. They haven't really studied, well, what is happening what happens in the body when we put aluminum, in there. And so what we do know from a mitochondrial energy standpoint, so on one of our other episodes, we talk about the Krebs cycle and how we digest and absorb our fats, proteins, and carbs to go through the Krebs cycle, and that's how we create a cellular energy of ATP. And aluminum is a known deterrent. It basically slows that pathway down, and it's measurable. And so that's just from the aluminum. I will note though. If you're worried about aluminum in the vaccine, you should also be worried about aluminum in your deodorants because it's also found there. Yeah. Mercury is the big one that a lot of people have been concerned, and with good reason. I've heard board-certified physicians, pediatricians say there's mercury in fish, and you eat lots of fish, and they're not wrong, but it's a different type of mercury. Methylmercury is, we do have a lot of fish poisoning that happens. I think Tony Robbins, his wife was investigated for mercury poisoning because he was eating swordfish every single day, and he was getting contamination from the degree from the fish.
But we're also adults with, fully functional immune systems. And so let's add that to the argument. We're not talking about fish. I eat tuna fish all the time.
Totally.
I love it. But, my immune system is more functional than an infant.
Sure.
So that has to be part of it.
Yeah, it's definitely part of it. But an ethyl mercury, and we can test that. We can test the difference if somebody has a mercury toxicity. We can find out if it's an ethyl mercury.
I should probably take that test. I do eat a lot of tuna.
Yeah, or methyl mercury, just to see, and then to support your clearance, of it. The omega-3, again, risk benefit, right? There's especially if you also like eating your high omega-6 animal meat in the Midwest.
I do.
That we're a big proponent for it.
A whole cow next Monday.
Yeah, yes. Good. But no, we're big proponents on omega-3 and omega-3 from fish. But from the mercury standpoint, there's 200 parts per billion equals toxic. And the thimerosal fluvials has over 50,000 parts per billion.
Wow.
Yeah. And then some other concerning additives are formaldehyde, which is a known carcinogen, polysorbate 80, which enhances the blood barrier penetration. Yeah, they talk a lot about, it doesn't pass the blood-brain barrier. Well, if you have polysorbate 80, it actually really can.
Wow.
Other, just live virus is capable of shedding residual antibiotics. And then proteins often contain yeast proteins, egg proteins, or bovine and porcine, which, again, sometimes people don't even realize that they might have, depending on their religious background.
Sure.
Some of these vaccines are actually also in deeper conflict. And then the fetal cell lines, which, you and Brooke said that you had investigated.
That's a big part of it for us, yeah.
And we could probably do an episode just on that alone.
Yeah, I think there's so much to be learned in that conversation that I would even suggest a lot of the pediatricians that I've talked to, and it's not just been a couple, were completely unaware of this part of the conversation. Now, granted, that was 20 plus years ago initially, and a lot of this has come to light, but they've actually since changed the way that the vaccines are identified on the FDA and CDC websites to make it more difficult to tell which ones have the fetal cell lines. It used to be completely obvious. They were just clearly labeled.
Sure.
And so the original research that we were doing 24 years ago, it was obvious. Now you have to almost have a key to a map in order to really know what's being exposed on those websites.
Sure.
And so you can go on there and say, oh, well, it doesn't say anything about that. Well, it's because you don't have the key to the map anymore.
Sure.
So that's part of the problem. But yeah, I actually do think there's a ministry, an organization, nonprofit here in Iowa, Informed Choices, that does a really good job on this subject. And one of their board members, Katie Adrian, a number of years ago, she now lives in Arizona, but was in our church for a number of years, her and her husband, Josh. And she was really involved in this movement and that organization. And she shared a hour-and-a-half long presentation at our church a number of years ago. It's called Stories of the Sacrificed. It's on our app. Just go to any of the app stores, Calvary Cedar Rapids, just type that in there and you'll find it. Stories of the Sacrificed. And it is an exhaustive look at the fetal cell lines and the history of that, and really undoing some of the lies that are being told about, how that's not really a part of the program anymore. I think that's got to be a huge part of the conversation, because what do we even know about the infants that, these lines were cultured in? So a huge part of it. And I think from that, you get into a lot of conversations about autism and things of that nature. But I think, to be fair, that probably is a conversation all in and of itself. And maybe I'll work on trying to get Katie out here to sit down with us. That would be pretty excellent.
Yeah, I think that would be great. From a timing standpoint, what are you thinking? Do you think this episode 1 winding down?
Yeah, I think we've made a dent in the conversation on vaccines. Come back next week. Maybe we'll dig a little bit deeper, try to finish some of this off. But I will tell you that regardless of what you're hearing from us or anybody else, I'm going to take you back to the Word of God. 1 Thessalonians 5:21, it says, "Prove all things and hold fast that which is good." Prove it. When we're talking about doctrinal things, take what people tell you about the Bible, about God, take it back to His Word. What does it have to say? When it's about anything else, especially your body and your health, you are your best advocate. You might be your only advocate in some cases, unless you have a doctor like CJ. So I would encourage you to do your homework, dig as deep as you can, and then dig a little deeper, because the information's out there. It's not always easy to find. And in the information era that we're in, I think sometimes because there's so much information, it's hard to find sometimes the pins and needles that we're looking for. But if you do the work, you'll be blessed because of it. And don't forget, especially in this conversation, it's about our kids and it's about our grandkids and it's about their kids and their grandkids if the Lord tarries. And I think that we owe them to do this research. We owe them to have these conversations, and then, to maybe get a little bit louder about it as time goes by, because I do think the way that the system is set up, the situation has to change. Yeah. And again, whatever side of the aisle you're on in this conversation, it's okay. We love you. Pro or con, it's okay. We love you. But let's have the conversation. Be willing to listen. Be willing to learn. We're willing to listen to you. Do your homework. We love you guys. Thanks for tuning in today. Dr. Kala, thank you so much. As always, it's such a blessing to sit with you.
Likewise. Thank you.
I look forward to next week. God bless.
Thanks for joining us today on Whole Health. If you'd like to learn more about our program, have a question for our hosts, or want to find past episodes, just head to wholehealthlive.com.